And I think there is something to a lot of organizations believe they're customer centric. But if you would go in and you would say, okay, is it in your daily processes? Is it repeatable? Is it measurable? Is it something, that you're then taking and you're using the data and the insights and you're making changes to your product, your marketing, your sales, your customer experience? If we're not following it in that systematic method, it's not real. And if it's not real, it's not making significant change for our organizations.
Welcome to the Buyer-Centric OS. Buyer-Centric OS, a system for revolutionary customer experience. With your hosts, Andy Halko and Tony Zayas. This show helps you turn guesswork into growth by putting your buyer at the center of everything.
All right, welcome everyone here to the fourth episode of the Buyer-Centric Operating System. Andy, today represents a little bit of a shift, moving from, we were talking theoreticals, looking at being buyer-centric and all of that, but what's the big thing that we should look forward to as we move into today's discussion?
Yeah, this is really the mindset of the book, is that it's the buyer-centric operating system. That we are not here to create a really cool philosophy, a theory. The book was not a concept where we just wanted to pique people's interest and give them an idea and say, oh, here's the problem that you're facing. What we wanted to do was outline a very clear system for people to install in their organization so that they can become customer centric. And so this is really the point that we start talking about. Let's shift from a poster on a wall that says, act like you're in your customer's shoes, to actual actions that can go in your processes, in your meetings, in the way that you interact with customers, can create cadence and measurement around what you do in the organization to ensure that you're staying buyer-centric. And this really just sets us up for all of the core pieces that we'll talk about in the future, like the maturity model. Where are you in buyer-centricity? The buyer-centric lens is, how do you get perspective from your target customers? The flywheel, which talks about the systems in the business and how you can spin the flywheel around the customer. And then the framework, which actually gets into the four elements that do turn this into a system. And so we're really turning that corner from the challenge that most companies aren't buyer-centric, personas are dead, there's forces pulling them away from the buyer, to now, how do we solve it with a real system that we can install into the organization?
I think that's key, those words, right? System to install, because typically the challenge with like a great concept and a lot of books is that ideas are great, but then how do you take that concept and how do you implement it? What are the actionable steps? What do you put in place? How do you get buy-in and adoption? So what I like about what you've done in the buyer-centric operating system is you've built a lot of that in and how it's defined. So what is that starting point, and how do we begin to move? Like what is that first step to move from, okay, concept, yeah, I totally buy into this. Now let's go, let's implement this.
Well, before I would get into that, I would say, just like any challenge in a business, it's a little bit of understanding that you aren't there. I think that, companies that do have those posters on the wall, or they do talk internally and say, yeah, we really focus on the customer, but in reality, that is not happening. And they are treating it as an empty shirt, something that there's posters on the wall, maybe leadership talks about, but in their daily actions, there's no real execution of being buyer centric. So I think first, it's obviously saying you have a problem. And then two, following along with the initial philosophy that the customer is everything, that you do really believe getting closer to them, centering the business around them will improve everything you do, creating better products and services, improving marketing efficiency, improving sales effectiveness, retaining customers. So I think the first place before you start really thinking about the system even is really making sure that you as an organization, a leadership team, step back and say, we know that the customer is everything. And if we center around them, it will be game changing for our company. And today, even if we say it, we're really not living it. And so that to me is kind of the starting point to make sure you set a foundation for, we have to install a system rather than just keep talking about it or just, put nice things out there, do things randomly. And hey, we threw a survey out last quarter, so we're customer centric. Well, that is not true. And so I think we start there, and then that's where we can start really building into the system.
So it's getting honest, and it's acknowledging that you're not delivering on that thought or that concept, and admitting to that and saying, but also spreading the idea that the need is there, that in order for us to grow, we have to have this customer centricity.
And having a business for 23 years, I can tell you one of the most important things is finding honesty in yourself, whether you're a leader or an organization. And I think we've talked about this in previous shows, and even part of the 4 forces is, that bias of not admitting reality, right? And I think there is something to a lot of organizations believe they're customer centric. But if you would go in and you would say, okay, is it in your daily processes? Is it repeatable? Is it measurable? Is it something, that you're then taking and you're using the data and the insights and you're making changes to your product, your marketing, your sales, your customer experience? If you can't sit down and basically assess the fact that you are doing this in, almost SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, all of these things, if we're not following it in that systematic method, it's not real. And if it's not real, it's not making significant change for our organizations. And so I think that companies do need to, follow a system like in this book, or create a system where it can be installed and become, ingrained in processes, repeatable, measurable, something that truly impacts change.
And so as we look at, moving into implementation, so there's the initial steps that have to be there, right? You have to buy into this concept and realize the transformation that it can bring. How do you create scalability amongst a concept like that across teams? Because I'm assuming you have to get to that point. You got to get kind of that buy-in and acknowledgement, not just from the top, but across teams, at least team leadership. Or is that part of the rollout of an implementation?
Well, I think that's part of the rollout, right? Is that when you systemize something, it starts becoming cultural. Right. I do think it needs to be in the DNA of an organization to be customer centric. But to me, you don't make those changes with the posters, with the memos, with these other things. You make it with systems and processes that you can come in, and then it becomes where for each person that's in the organization, it's just part of how they operate. And when it becomes part of how they operate, it becomes the cultural norm. And when anybody new comes in the organization, they are trained into the system so that from day one, they're just naturally customer-centric, buyer-centric. And so when we get into the, really developing the operating system, we'll talk about the flywheel of how you have developing a great product that is buyer-centric, which drives into marketing. How do you really create a good brand and message to put out to the marketplace that is representative of what the buyer wants? Sales, where you're really getting into, how do you understand them and change from trying to urgently move them through a deal to building trust and value, and then into delivery, where you're actually, making sure that you produce results that the buyer actually wants and they value, and that you're reflecting back to them that they have achieved that value and that benefit that aligns with their needs, into service, where it's really an evangelism, where it's about now how do we convert this buyer into someone that, didn't just transact with us, but actually cares about us and wants to share that experience with others so that we grow. And then, and share their own experience about their service or product that goes back into product, and we can continue to, build that flywheel that spins around the organization. And so, again, when you go into a company, a lot of times that poster is for the customer service team. And that's the last piece in the flywheel. And so if you didn't add systems and processes into product development, marketing, sales, delivery, that flywheel can't spin. It will stay stagnant. And you want that flywheel to spin around your buyer, because that speed, that traction is what really, to me, scales organizations, when each of those pillars is moving in sync around the buyer. And so, again, there is no way that a poster, a memo, a little saying that everybody has about the customer is going to cause that flywheel to spin. It's impossible. The only thing that can do it is embedding it in meetings, embedding it in OKRs, is measuring it, is saying, like, this is how we actually act every day to make sure across these 5 areas that we are staying buyer-centric.
So what it sounds like is there are aspects of this that could be more ceremony than actual system implementation. But by doing that, you're fooling yourself, you're fooling the organization just because of the memos and the posters and things like that. So that's super interesting to think about. And like, how can you tell the difference? How do you know, like, to your point, you're saying, really embedding things into the workflows and the ways things are done. How do you have awareness of that as you're trying to roll this out?
Yeah, I mean, we get into the framework next. So the flywheel is about these elements of the business going around the buyer. The next is going to be the framework, which we'll dig into a lot, but it has to do with rituals, things that we, create a cadence around, regimens, which are much more specific for how we act, twins, where we really look at how do we understand the buyer. And so we want to build in this framework, and we can really, I think, easily assess whether we've got those systems and processes versus whether we've got ceremonies. And so the operating system is really about that, is using that framework, which we'll talk about, probably very in depth, each of those different elements of it, but using that framework to drive the flywheel. And it really is, when you drive that flywheel, that's when organizations see significant impact in top line, bottom line, sentiment from their, customers.
And when we're talking about, accountability for this whole initiative becoming buyer-centric, who are the key people that become kind of the champions for the sake of accountability? Is that one person that's kind of the buyer-centric czar, or is it spread out? Like, what do you recommend in that regard? And obviously it's going to vary organization to organization somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone needs to be part of this. That's why in the system we talk about, leadership and how they drive it. We talk about how you install customer-centric metrics into OKRs and other meetings that you might have, whether you run that type of system or not, but really embedding it all the way. But then, to your point, a lot of times we do recommend trying to have someone play the role of the buyer-centric champion, where their job is to make sure that the system is operating the way that it needs to, that they can come in and they can help install it. And then each of those elements of the flywheel, product, marketing, sales, delivery, service, that they are constantly in check to make sure that those areas of the business are following the system, are using the measurements correctly, are pulling in the right information, and then sharing what they know between each other. And so that buyer-centric champion really does become a catalyst, but it does have to be organization-wide. You can't just bring in a champion and your leadership team isn't on board, and installing the system pushes it throughout the organization. And so I think you really need to see this as a truly organizational shift, top down, bottom up.
Right. And that totally makes sense. Love the idea of the champion. And that's something that I know you go into more detail in the book and talk about. We're going to continue down this path of really moving from we introduced the concept and talked about a number of things in the first few shows, but now we're going more into kind of systematizing and implementation. We'll continue down this path. If you guys have not checked out the book, it's for sale on Amazon and elsewhere. The Buyer-Centric Operating System, check it out. And we will see you on the next episode. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for tuning into the Buyer-Centric OS. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and grab your copy of the Buyer-Centric Operating System by Andy Halko, available now on Amazon. For more tools and insights, visit andyhalko.com.